public?
I think there are two issues here. He has an agenda. The agenda is not merely Israel's security, if I could put merely in quotation marks. It is greater Israel. And what that means in the political jargon is that Netanyahu and his government want Israeli control permanently over all of Palestine, that is the West Bank and Gaza, as well as today's Israel. In other words, they have a political agenda that they are fighting for. That political agenda is contrary to international law, contrary to repeated UN Security Council and UN General Assembly resolutions, contrary ostensibly to U.S. public policy, as Biden kind of mumbles it each day, that the U.S. insists on a two-state solution. So Netanyahu is fighting a war for a political outcome that is against the international will of almost every country in the world and against international law. Now, can he do that? He can do that up to the moment when the United States says enough. And probably the U.S. is getting close to that, not out of any great revelation of justice or international law, but because this is very bad politics for the U.S., bad politics diplomatically when almost the entire world is now on the other side. And bad politics domestically because the American public does not support Israel in this cruelty, in the war crimes, or in the intention of dominating the entire region. So this is why Netanyahu's war, I think, will be short-lived, could be extraordinarily damaging. It could still provoke, as I think the Israeli government wants, a wider war in the Middle East, in which case what I've just said would not be correct because things could spin out of control. But I think that what should happen, the United States should say today, no, we don't support you in a war for that purpose, period. And what I think is likely to happen is that it will get shut down fairly quickly.
Do you think that Joe Biden can overcome the pressures of domestic politics and the influence of the Israeli lobby on the U.S. Congress and say that to him? I mean, he could have said that 2 weeks ago. He could say it this afternoon. He could stop the war while this show is on if he wanted to with a phone call.
As always, Judge, American politics means two different things. One, it means public opinion. And the second, it means powerful lobbies. When it comes to public opinion, Biden does not have the American public support. Quite the contrary. He is losing the public support. Young people especially are aghast at what Israel is doing, but it's not just young people. The American public as a whole has said strongly in opinion survey after opinion survey that they want peace, they want Israel to stop what it's doing, that they don't want the United States to be abetting this. Then there is the powerful AIPAC lobby, the Israel lobby. Of course, it is pretty unrelenting. But in an election year, it's not all powerful. And I'm sure that the White House is shocked at how they've lost the public support because they don't understand public opinion anyway. And they certainly miscalculated about the opinions of people under the age of 35 and especially under the age of 25, but a very significant proportion of the electorate. And this is an election year, and Biden is losing electoral support. So that has to loom large. But in addition, we have one vote after another, whether it's in the UN Security Council of 13 to 1, where the U.S. stands alone in its veto, or whether it's in the UN General Assembly, the recent vote, 153 countries with 89% of the world's population voting for an immediate ceasefire, and the United States on the other side with 10 countries of 5% of the world population, of which were 4%, and the other 9 countries representing less than 1% of the world population. So we're alone in this.
Can the IDF defeat Hamas? Or, and I don't want to box you into either or, but I'm just thinking out loud. Is Hamas an idea that cannot be eradicated?
The idea that can't be eradicated is the idea of Palestine's political rights, whether it is 2 states, as the world community has repeatedly voted, including the United States, for 57 years since the so-called Six-Day War in June 1967, or 1 state, which is a secular, ostensibly democratic state, which would have a majority of Palestinians in it, and Hamas, whatever version of that state, maybe it doesn't want a democratic state, who knows, but it wants 1 state that is Palestine. What cannot be eradicated is Palestinian political rights. And as much as the Israelis attack and bomb and displace 2 million people and kill thousands or tens of thousands of people in Gaza, there will be millions of Palestinians demanding political rights, and there will be a vast majority of world opinion also backing them in that demand.
Here's a person whose image you will recognize. This is from 2013, predicting with a remarkable clarity just what we're seeing today.
Netanyahu now, I believe, has decided unequivocally to move to a one-state solution, which every one of his predecessors in the prime ministership have condemned as a disaster for Israel. And I think Israel is now moving toward a disaster for itself and insisting that all the way from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea has to be Israeli controlled. That is a mistake.
How prescient and how decent President Carter was on this issue all along.
And how things don't change.
Well,
I mean,
Netanyahu,
it's almost as if he's not in the physical condition that he's in, and he's talking about what happened yesterday.
No, this is exactly correct. And Netanyahu has been on this line, and anyone that watches this has known that Israel, in this current dispensation of an extreme right-wing government, is out to do anything possible to stop peace based on 2 states. And we are arming that hour by hour for mass killing. So we're complicit in the war crimes. And for what? For something that is absolutely antithetical to peace and antithetical to international law. We're really in a terrible state of affairs of complete dishonesty of our own policy in the United States because we're supporting the unsupportable.
Here is the Israeli ambassador to the United Kingdom. Now, it's a difficult interview to watch because they keep cutting each other off. Candidly, even though I disagree with what she's saying, the interviewer is cutting her off more than she's cutting him. But you'll get the picture.
You need to do
two-state solution?
What
Is
you
there
did.
still a chance for a two-state solution?
I think it's about time for the world to realize the Oslo paradigm failed on the 7th of October, and we need to build a new one. And in order to build a new
does
one...
that new one include the Palestinians living in a state of their own? Is that what it includes?
I think the biggest question is what type of Palestinians are on the other side. This is what Israel realized
do they
on
have
the
a
7th of
state,
October.
though?
The answer is absolutely no, and I'll tell you why.
Well, then how can there be peace? How can there be peace in
the reason there is no peace
Israel
is because the Palestinians...
without offering
Mark,
a state to Palestine, how can there be peace in Israel?
Israel knows today, and the world should know now, the reason the Oslo Accords failed is because the Palestinians never wanted to have a state next to Israel. They want to have a state from the river to the sea.
So the two-state solution is dead?
why are you obsessed with a formula that never worked, that created these radical people in the other side? Why are you obsessed with that?
Man, is that the attitude of the Netanyahu government about the rights of the Palestinian people to live peacefully in their own sovereign state?
Well, explicitly, one just has to look at the government, what it says, and the party platforms of Netanyahu's Likud or Otzma Yehudit, which is another extreme right-wing party represented in the government. Listen to the Israeli finance minister, Bezalel Smotrich, who even called himself a fascist at one point and stood in front of a map recently that people can find online, where he spoke in front of a map showing Israel from the river to the sea, the idea of greater Israel. Or listened to the defense minister Gallant or the interior minister Ben Gvir. These are right-wing extremists that don't hide what they're doing. We just don't want to listen, but they don't hide what they're doing. They want complete control over millions of people, or preferably for some of them, and I think what they're trying to implement right now, ethnic cleansing, so that those people don't live there anymore.
I know you are an economist and a historian, not a military person. But is there any conceivable military benefit to the IDF, to bombing and destroying a Gazan cemetery? Or is that just to wreak havoc on the memory of those who died and were peacefully buried there?
What we know is that Israel is bombing schools, clinics, hospitals, residential structures, people in open flight. They're killing massively. And this tragedy of 3 hostages escaping and then being killed by Israeli forces is basically a reflection of a simple point. They're shooting to kill anyone.
Does the Israeli public understand that that's the policy of their government? Shoot to kill anyone, even bare-chested, barefoot young men carrying a white flag and begging for help and mercy in Hebrew?
Yes, basically the Israeli public has backed this government according to the opinion surveys up until this incident, and this is the first time there are protests. You know, the Israeli public is in a kind of a post-traumatic syndrome right now after October 7, and they're fed despicable language by the government. So this is not the case of the government acting as a renegade force. It's a government that's committing massive war crimes and that is stoking the public hatred. After 9/11, you know, in our country, it was possible to stoke the public to go to war just about anywhere, even when it was transparently clear, at least to me, that the war was on in Iraq was on completely phony pretexts, or the attempt to overthrow the Syrian government or the Libyan government were on phony pretexts in 2011. But the publics can be manipulated by governments that have agendas. And this Netanyahu government is filled with extremists with a very clear political agenda. And I always urge, when we talk about Ukraine or when we talk about Gaza, I always go back to one of the most famous lines in The Theory of War by Karl von Clausewitz, who was the German war theorist after the Napoleonic Wars, who wrote the famous volume on war in 1832. And he said something completely right, completely memorable, and crucial for everybody listening to understand. Von Clausewitz famously said that war is the continuation of politics with other means. When you see war understand politics. And this is politics. The politics here is the politics of greater Israel. What does that mean? It's a long-standing doctrine for extreme religious zealots and for some others that God gave the Israelites all the land, by the way, not only from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean, but if you look at the book of Joshua, from the Nile to the Euphrates, it's even more frightening. It's even more frightening. Now, there are people in Israel in government
Who believe that?
Or who follow that. Whatever they believe, they follow that. So this is about politics. And the politics is that this is absolutely horrendous. It's a complete barrier to any peace and the United States because of APEC lobby or because of mistrained politicians, because of ignorance or confusion, are completely complicit in it. Not just in votes in the UN, I want to emphasize repeatedly, but in providing daily the munitions for the war. We are completely, hourly complicit in it. And when Lloyd Austin or Jake Sullivan say, oh, you have to be more careful, they're feeding the bombs by the hour. And we have the story today in the New York Times that these are dumb bombs. Well, America's feeding these bombs that are destroying civilian populations, and people should think about how Israel has displaced 2 million people in this very short period of time. It's actually a lot of people.
Yeah. I want to switch gears. Last week, President Zelensky came to the United States asking for money, and it did not go well for him. The Republicans in the House of Representatives didn't even want to hear him. He did speak unofficially to a caucus of most senators. Some of them left. It doesn't appear as though President Biden's 60 or 68 billion for Ukraine is going to come to pass, even with the other compromises that certain factions in the Republican Party are demanding. Over the weekend, the Financial Times led with a story that Great Britain and the United States are thinking of confiscating the frozen Russian assets, which comes to about $300 billion. These are not government assets. These are assets of companies and individuals that Joe Biden and Rishi Sunak and his predecessor, I forget which one, seized. The governments are thinking of confiscating them, selling them, and providing most of the proceeds to President Zelensky. How bad would that be?
Well, first, let me say something about this $61 billion request. Not only is it a colossal waste of money, because actually 61 billion isn't exactly chump change, but it's completely devastating for Ukraine as well, because what it is saying to Ukraine, continue to be cannon fodder for a few more months, continue to die tens of thousands or even hundreds of thousands more, because we'll continue to pump in the money for you to run to the front lines and be killed.
Right.
That's what this is. So this is nothing in the interest of the Ukrainian people, period. And it's nothing in the interest of the United States. And the solution to this war, to have avoided it in the first place, to have ended it in March 2022, and to end it today, is for Biden to pick up the phone and talk to Putin and say, NATO's not going to enlarge. We need to stop this fighting, period. And this is what should have been said all along. This
He's
again,
not going to do it.
I know he's not. So now coming to your question, I just want to make sure that, I want to do whatever I can to make sure is the way I should say that when Congress reconvenes and they try again and again to get us to spend more money, it's for nothing. It's a disaster. Tell your congressmen and senators, stop this already. It's not saving Ukraine. Quite the contrary. It's getting Ukraine destroyed. It's not saving us. It's no security for us. It is the vanity of Biden not to have negotiated all along and to have avoided this war or to have stayed out of the way when Ukraine and Russia were going to end it in April 2022 on the basis of Ukraine's neutrality. And then we stepped in and said, no, you don't. You keep fighting. So this is the first point. Now, confiscating the money, by the way, the 300 billion largely is Russian government assets in Eurobonds and European securities held heavily by a Belgian entity, which is a depository institution. Okay, it's completely illegal. There's no way to do this legally. It's completely reckless. If the U.S. wants to totally break the international law, international finance, and do what it wants, the consequences of that kind of lawlessness will be extremely great for the U.S., for the dollar, for the international system, but it's against the law what's being talked about. Of course, these are desperate politicians and not very bright politicians. So they're constantly asking the technocrats, can't you do it this way? Can't you do it that way? They don't want it. They can't get it through a vote to actually provide funds because the public doesn't want it. And even a Congress that normally goes along with funding military things knows that this is ridiculous. So they're going to try to do it illegally. States have immunity in their assets. You can't just do this. Of course, they may try to do it, but it would be completely reckless. It would open the United States up to so many charges, lawsuits, counter actions, and so forth. I hope they figure this out. They haven't figured out much so far, but I hope they figure this one out.
What do you think Joe Biden is talking about when he says the United States is the essential nation? Is this
I think
a Cold War era mentality that we will liberate Eastern Europe, which of course has already been liberated?
I think Joe Biden lives in the past, not hugely surprisingly. These are words out of the 1990s, which were inappropriate then. They were the kind of vainglory of the United States at the end of the Cold War. We won, you lost. We are the indispensable power. These are words of Madeleine Albright, who was the Secretary of State, that was one of the first neocons that pushed NATO enlargement and pushed a lot of other mischief that has put us into the trouble that we're in right now. Biden's been part of that group from the 1990s onward. I don't think he's got exactly his finger on the pulse of reality these days in public opinion, public understanding, international law, negotiations, ways to solve these crises. But what he is saying is words out of the 1990s, almost verbatim, or sometimes verbatim, and they make no sense in our current period. They made no sense to me back in the 1990s, by the way. I thought it was a lot of bluster that would go badly wrong then.
Thank you. But while you were away, the Congress of the United States of America used its subpoena power to compel the testimony of college presidents, and certain members of Congress proceeded to berate these college presidents because they didn't say what members of Congress thought they should say about the exercise of free speech on their private college campuses. Now, you are on the campus of Columbia University as we speak. The president of Columbia was not involved in this. You and I have very strong views about the First Amendment. We are both free speech champions. What are your views about Congress berating college presidents because the presidents didn't say what Congress thought they should have said about public issues like the war in Gaza?
Well, I think the way that this congressional hearing with three university presidents, the university presidents of UPenn, of Harvard, and of MIT, was disgusting. The Congress behaved very badly, especially this Stefanik congresswoman from upstate New York. not only were they completely out of line, but they were absolutely misconstruing basic facts, either lying or just completely ignorant, and really causing a lot of pain and undermining of our institutions, I would say. And it's not over yet. It's not only the Congress, of course, it's large donors to the universities. They want to hear the campuses perform the way they want. In the particular case we're talking about, they want only pro-Israel messages coming from the campus authorities and the students. And people have different ideas about the crisis underway in Gaza. Our students, many students are protesting Israel's invasion and bombing of Gaza. I protest it too. I find it war crimes, basically. And to say that, though, boy, that runs against what some of these Congress people think, or what some of these donors think. And so what? That's what free speech is. And especially in a moment like this, with such high political stakes, political free speech is essential. Now, what happened was that Stefanik deliberately and obnoxiously misconstrued words and protests on the campus, specifically in her interrogation, because that's what it was, of President Gay of Harvard. She said that when student protesters, pro-Palestinian protests, by the way, both of the Jewish and non-Jewish students, protesting on the side of the Palestinians and against Israeli actions, were chanting Intifada, or from the river to the sea, meaning the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. They were calling for the murder of Jews. That's what Stefanik said. No, they were making a political statement. They were making a statement that was against prevailing Israel government policies, but they were exercising political speech at a time when we need political debate, because what's happening, in fact, is horrible. Thousands and thousands of women and children are being killed, and it's natural and important that there be political debate about this. Almost all the world is against Israel's policies, is aghast at Israel's policies, and voted in the UN General Assembly a couple of days ago by a vote of 150 countries to just in favor of an 13,
in favor of a
13
ceasefire.
against, yes. If I've got the number, if I remember the numbers correctly.
Let me just stop you for a minute.
A little bit jet lagged.
Right, I know you want to go deeply into the UN because of your familiarity with it, but before
but Judge, just to say before we get off the topic, that what the students are expressing, the point I was going to make without digressing to the UN, is they're expressing a view which is widespread around the world. They are not calling for the murder of Jews, as Stefanik, in a very vulgar and incorrect way, said. They are calling for a stop to Israel's war against the Palestinians, and calling for is outrageous.
But the whole purpose, you know this, everybody listening to us knows this. Supreme Court has said it 100 times. The whole purpose of the First Amendment is to keep the government out of the business of speech. It is none of the government's business what the students say on a college campus and how the presidents of the universities respond to it. This Congresswoman Stefanik was just using her power as a member of Congress and a member of this committee and the subpoena power to berate, humiliate, these college presidents, and it cost one of them her job.
Well, it was absolute bullying because the very premises of her question were ludicrous and false. First, the whole premise was that students on the campuses are calling for the mass murder of Jews, for the genocide of Jews. This is not the case.
Right.
They are making political speech, not advocating murder. She didn't cite one case. And when you start looking at this, you find out, and AP did a good job of exposing the falsehoods being carried on the social media, literally putting words in videos into the mouths of the protesters, which is not what the protesters are actually saying. So Stefanik, either knowingly or ignorantly, was misconstruing what the protests are about. And then as the university presidents were grappling with what for them was a hypothetical, because their students are not calling for a genocide or a murder of Jews, and they were asked about it, they said, whatever kind of speech has to be considered in context. And that statement was viewed as, oh, so intellectual, we need to fire this president. And actually the president of UPenn stepped down, which is so sad. I don't know the full background to that. The chair of the board stepped down as well. What we do know is that they were bullied not only by the Congress, but by some of their big donors from Wall Street. And these people can be real bullies.
Right. Tell us about the U.S. veto of the very sensible humanitarian resolution calling for a ceasefire in the Security Council. A couple of questions. How do American diplomats react at the UN when they are so overwhelmingly at odds? Did the U.S. attempt to dissuade the General Assembly from its vote after the veto in the Security Council? How does this play out when the U.S. is so isolated, and isolated along with a country whose murderous rampages it could stop with a phone call?
Well, this is the key point. The U.S. is not an observer to what is happening. The U.S. is a direct, and not just in a political sense, in a logistical sense, a direct accomplice. It is U.S. munitions that are being used by Israel, and not from stockpiles, from current, ongoing, daily deliveries of munitions. The United States is working hand in hand with Israel in this campaign in Gaza. Now, this so-called military campaign in Gaza against Hamas, as it said, has displaced nearly 2 million people who are now crowded, hungry, dying of disease, without access to health care. And at latest count, a verified count of 18,000 people killed, and probably many, many more under the rubble. And 70% of those women and children. And the United States is providing daily the weapons for this. So what does the world community say, as represented by the governments, the 193 member states of the UN? It says overwhelmingly, stop this. Stop this killing. This is mass civilian slaughter before our eyes. And by the way, with a political end that is utterly unacceptable, because what does the Israeli government say? It doesn't say, we're defeating Hamas so we can have justice with the Palestinian people. Netanyahu, who in my view is an absolute corrupt thug, says never to a Palestinian state. So what is the outcome of this? Also, the outcome is this idea of complete Israeli control over Palestine. This is a vision that many of his members of the cabinet have of the so-called Greater Israel, in which Israel either expels the Palestinians or it dominates them in an apartheid state. But Netanyahu's not even offering a political solution that is even remotely acceptable morally or according to international law. Now, the United States is siding with this. So the vote was 150 governments calling for an immediate ceasefire, 10 opposing. That's the United States and a few very small countries, the largest, Guatemala and Paraguay, and then a few islands, and then 23 countries abstaining. Now, if you look at the share of the world accounted by these votes, nearly 90% of the world lives in the countries that voted stop the killing. The United States, on the side of 5% of the world population, for ourselves in the US, and another 1%, these other countries, and 5% abstaining. In other words, we are isolated diplomatically, and even our closest allies right now are saying privately or publicly, we can't go on with a mass slaughter of civilians before our eyes. And then these geniuses in the White House, Jake Sullivan, not my favorite, says, okay, just a few more weeks of the slaughter. It's going to have to come to an end. Just a few more weeks.
I want you to listen to what the deputy U.S. ambassador said to the UN, who cast the veto, said justifying the veto. And then I want you to listen to what 3 Arab diplomats had to say in response. This is after the vote in the Security Council, not after the vote in the General Assembly.
Although the United States strongly supports a durable peace in which both Israelis and Palestinians can live in peace and security, we do not support this resolution's call for an unsustainable ceasefire that will only plant the seeds for the next war.
We believe there is a moral obligation toward the international community to stop the killing of the Palestinian civilians. And it's the first time, at least in my lifetime, that I have seen that calling for a ceasefire became a controversial issue.
I'm not sure how deep is the understanding here of what's happening on the ground in Gaza. I mean, this war has broken every record. Largest number of journalists killed, largest number of hospitals destroyed, largest number of medics killed, largest number of UN employees killed.
Our message has been very clear. There needs to be an immediate ceasefire, there needs to be a cessation of hostilities, and we need to have immediate access for humanitarian aid. It is not acceptable.
What did diplomats, I think you have your finger on something here, Jeff. What did diplomats say not for publication and behind closed doors? Does Rishi Sunak, the Prime Minister of Great Britain, call up Biden and say, hey, Joe, we can't back you up much longer, or I'm going to be voted out of office? Netanyahu is intentionally slaughtering women and children, and you are providing him the means with which to do it. Do conversations like that happen either between heads of state or among diplomats at the UN?
They are happening right now, and Netanyahu is showing the finger to the American president, by the way, because Biden, in a kind of a pathetic and weak way, is saying, well, you know, we need a two-state solution and so forth. And Netanyahu is saying, hell no two-state solution. We determine things. And the United States says, okay, we back you up. Whatever you want, we'll keep sending the weapons. So who's running things? Whose weapons are these? Whose bombs are these? These are our bombs. And if we wanted to stop this, it's not even convincing Israel to do something. Stop providing the bombs. Literally, it's a logistical matter. It's not even a political matter. We are an accomplice to this. So if Biden wants something different, stand up and be a president.
The Israeli Defense Forces captured young civilian men, stripped them down into their underwear, paraded them in front of cameras. There's 3 war crimes right there: the kidnapping, the stripping, and the parading in front of the cameras, and claimed that they were Hamas soldiers surrendering. That, of course, has been debunked. The tape of the so-called surrender was farcical. These guys were not soldiers at all. But when this happens, the international humiliation of innocent civilians, what does this do for Israeli and American standing in the world community? And how, if at all, does it exacerbate things to the point where other countries in the region will be forced by popular demand to do something?
Look, the United States is essentially completely isolated together with Israel in this. As I said, 1% of the world population joined the United States in the veto of this General Assembly resolution. A few tiny countries. That's it. And we should take note, if we care anything about American diplomacy, not that we do anymore, but if we care anything about American standing in the world, not that we seem to, but from a practical point of view, of course, we're completely isolated. I can't remember, of all the horrible things that happened, I can't remember another time so vividly when we see hour by hour the mass slaughter of people, when we hear the vulgarities coming from the government of Israel about how these are animals or we're going to starve them out, when we see actually nearly 2 million people displaced and their homes destroyed, and we can't figure out in the United States to do something different about this when it's our very bombs that are literally the bombs that are causing this destruction. It's shocking to me. Now, what also Biden doesn't understand is that he's lost the American people on this, and especially the young people. You know, this is partly a generational issue. Young people who don't have whatever perspective that older people do on this just see Israel killing civilians in a way that is completely unacceptable. And that's why they're protesting on the campuses also, and possibly why these older donors don't get it. But this is America now. We don't we don't like what's happening.
Is Joe Biden just stuck in a time warp where the United States is wedded at the hip to Israel? Does he not have his finger on the pulse of what the public wants? Surely the Congress doesn't have their collective fingers on the pulse of what the public wants. If you look at the AIPAC website, you'll see more than half the members of Congress's faces there. And all you do is click on the AIPAC website to donate to those members of Congress. This list goes on and on and on and on. Republicans, Democrats, liberals, conservatives. So it's the United States of America at odds with the normal human sensibilities of the American public, which is repulsed by what they see.
We know from opinion surveys that Americans are disgusted. They do not support at all Biden administration policies. It has been an absolute automatic standard of American politics. Don't show any space with Israel, no matter what. That has been the programmed logic of Congress and presidents for decades. But it is not the view of the American people that is a license to mass slaughter of civilians. And especially, and I think it's important to understand, there's no end game here other than, according to Israel, no end game other than Israeli domination of the Palestinian people, either their deaths or ethnic cleansing or living in an apartheid state, because our ally, the one that we are providing the bombs to every day, is saying straight out, no, there's not going to be a Palestinian state. And our president says, well, yeah, I know there needs to be a two-state solution. And who gets the bombs and who keeps the killing?
Right.
Israel. So,
Right.
it's really, this is how our politics has worked, but it's completely out of tune with the views of the American people now. And certainly generationally, there's an enormous change. And worldwide, there is a revulsion. I've been traveling as usual. I was in the Middle East. I was at the climate conference in the United Arab Emirates. I was in Ethiopia. I've heard nothing but horror at what Israel is doing and at what the United States is abetting. Not a voice to the contrary. People should understand this. And if the view is doesn't matter, public opinion doesn't matter, world opinion doesn't matter, international law doesn't matter, UN Security Council resolutions be damned, it's not a good thing, I will tell you, for the United States of America. We need normal relations with other countries. We can't be seen and should not be accomplices to war crimes, which unfortunately we are being right now. And by the way, the job of a president of the United States is to be more effective than whining.
Right. I want you to listen to and watch a comment from Colonel McGregor on the concept of asabiya. You probably know what this is, and I'd like your thoughts on it. It's fascinating.
So for us to talk about a just peace for the Palestinians in the minds of Arabs, Turks, and Iranians is essentially to say, we'll give you a just peace. It's called the cemetery. We'll give you the peace of the grave, and that's about it. Now, that satisfies the current government of Israel, but it puts us in a very difficult position globally as well as regionally. Now, the second point I want to make, and I think this is very important, there is a concept or a word in Arabic called asadiyah. This is a word you don't hear much anymore, but it's a word that refers to social cohesion, group solidarity, or unity of action. It is a word that was used by Ibn Khaldun, probably the most famous historian of the Middle Ages, who happened to have been an Arab from Tunis. His work had a profound impact on the West. Everyone from Toynbee to Oswald Spengler all studied and read his works. And in it, he says, those who have not seen the power of Islam do not appreciate it. Today, we have historically viewed, and today we view Islam as weak, a loose grouping of states that are more interested in killing each other than they are in doing any damage to anyone else. There have been a few exceptions, but that's essentially the analysis. Asadiyah, however, is emerging in the Arab world. It's emerging because of this war for Jewish supremacy in the region that we are supporting. And it is bringing states and peoples into coalition now that historically have not cooperated in any meaningful way for centuries.
What do you think, Professor Sachs?
Well, I think the one word I would change of that brilliant analysis is it's not the Jewish domination, it's Israeli domination, because there are a lot of Jews that are aghast at what is happening. And I think this is really important to state. This is a policy of an Israeli government that has also whipped up the Israeli public. But this is about Israel. It's not about a religion. But I think what Colonel McGregor is saying is absolutely right. And what is important to understand, and this is really crucial for us to understand and for our public discourse, the Arab and Islamic leaders more generally have been stating repeatedly in the United Nations, in a very important meeting in Riyadh, and in many meetings of the Arab League and Arab nations, that they want actual peace with Israel. But the peace is with two states, a state of Israel and a state of Palestine. And this also is what the United Nations has repeatedly called for in resolutions over many decades. The Arabs and Islamic leaders, and I am including Iran in that, just in case anybody is not sure about the point, are calling for peace with a two-state solution. They are not calling for the elimination of Israel. They are calling for the creation of a sovereign Palestinian state as the 194th member of the United Nations. And who stands directly against that is Netanyahu and his right-wing, extreme right-wing cabinet. And who abets Netanyahu, that is the president of the United States, who murmurs, oh, we want a two-state solution, and then provides the bombs for an ethnic cleansing of Gaza and mass murder. So this is pathetic. It's not as if there isn't an answer to this. There is an obvious answer to this. The answer is two states living side by side. And Netanyahu, even today, is explicit. No way. We're not going to do that. That's not what we're doing. And what does the U.S. government do? It says, okay, here's some more bombs. Go ahead.
I don't know how this ends, Jeff. Colonel McGregor and Scott Ritter, our two military experts, believe it will be expanded into a regional war that Netanyahu will not stop. Others believe Netanyahu will be driven from office and a new administration will stop the war. What do you think? How does this end? We took a poll, Jeff, among the viewers of the show. Hundreds of people responded. When do you think the war will end? 1 month, 2 months, 3 months? Was 47% longer than 6 months.
You know, I'm not very good at forecasting. I think a little bit better at recommending what could happen. What I have recommended in my rather extensive discussions with diplomats around the world in recent days is that the United Nations should vote immediately for the state of Palestine to become the 194th member of the United Nations along the 4th of June, 1967 borders, as has been called for repeatedly by the UN Security Council, and therefore is international law. Because with Palestine as a sovereign state and member of the United Nations, I believe would force the United States into the right answer. The right answer is that Israel can be secure with two states. Israel can never be secure with Netanyahu's approach. And the way to get to the two states is for the United States to say it is not acceptable by international law or US policy or human morality to use American bombs to bring about your greater Israel solution. And the United States just needs to say that at any moment. It needs to say within the UN Security Council, together with the other 14 members that absolutely would agree in a moment that the state of Palestine exists according to UN Security Council resolutions that date back for decades. So is that going to happen? Perhaps not. Perhaps Biden will continue to obfuscate, to murmur, to be weak in the sense of not standing up for international law and U.S. Interests of a normal, peaceful, decent world, that the U.S. will continue to block the obvious diplomacy. And let me add, and maybe it's obvious, but let me just expand for one moment. The way to make Israel secure is through a political solution, because what the Arab and more generally the Islamic countries are saying is we will support Israeli security. That means stopping the funding for militias like Hamas, stopping the armaments for resistance movements, providing peacekeepers under UN Security Council guidance. With a little bit of imagination, we could provide for Israeli physical security and end this conflict. But the whole game is to avoid the obvious. Netanyahu says the obvious, so we can listen. He says no political solution other than Israeli dominance. And we have to say, no, we don't sign up to that, and we don't give you bombs to enable you to do that. And then everything changes. We move to politics. We don't give up on Israel's security. We move to the demilitarization and demobilization, not only of Hamas, but of all of the other militias, and there are several, that attack Israel, but are funded from the Middle East or are even armed from the Middle East, because right now they're fighting for Palestine. And once a peace is achieved, in the way that the Arab countries themselves have been saying since 2002, there will also be security. A lot of the same points and rhetoric and ugliness that one sees in the comment pages, even of what I think of as sophisticated media like the Financial Times, is pretty simplistic and ugly and very Russophobic.
You were tasked to implement economic reforms in former Soviet Union as well as Russia during the 90s. What happened there when you asked for economic assistance in ensuring that these market reforms take place? How was the response of Washington back then?
Well, just to be clear, I wasn't tasked with implementing anything. You know, I'm an advisor and no power role, but they saw me as possibly a channel to Western finance. And I told them that I would try to be a channel to Western finance. Why? Because I believe that when a country is in financial trouble, the international financial system should help that country to get out of trouble, both as a basic matter of morality and ethics and as a win-win proposition for global cooperation. My guru in this is John Maynard Keynes, who wrote famously The Economic Consequences of the Peace in 1919. And his argument was that the harsh Versailles settlement with Germany would lead to future disaster. It's one of the prophetic books of the 20th century. When I was both a student and practitioner of finance, I took my cue from John Maynard Keynes. Don't be nasty to the defeated power or to the country that is down on its luck. Things that go around, come around, go around. If it's bad one day for somebody, it could be bad for you the next. It's better to be cooperative. I tried in the early 1990s to mobilize Western financial support for Gorbachev's reforms, complete failure. Then President Yeltsin's team asked me similarly. I was a complete failure in mobilizing support. Basically, not on economic argument grounds. My economics is good. It was good at the time. What I had recommended for Poland in financial terms was adopted because Poland was on our side. And I recommended debt relief. I recommended emergency stabilization funding, and it worked. It wasn't just a theory, it worked. So when I recommended the same thing with Russia, I thought, well, I've already shown that these ideas make sense. And they do make sense. But Washington rejected them, not because of the economic debate, which it was sometimes portrayed, but because of the geopolitics, which is, Poland's on our side, of course we'll help, but they are on the other side. So, of course, we won't help. And it is almost as simple as that.
Let us move to a fundamental debate that has failed in the German corporate media regarding Ukraine. We have also interviewed a wide range of experts from Noam Chomsky, Chris Hedges, Vijay Prashad, Peter Kasek on this matter, so it'd be interesting to get your view as well. Denazification and demilitarizations were reasons given by the Russian state to justify its war in Ukraine. Do you think these reasons had any legitimacy?
Look, the core of this is the clash between the United States and Russia. That clash goes back to 1992 when the neoconservatives took over American foreign policy. This was originally Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz in the administration of George W. Bush Sr. But there are a lot of neocons around. Madeleine Albright was a neoconservative. Hillary Clinton was a neoconservative. Victoria Nuland, who was Assistant Secretary of State during the Maidan in 2014, is now the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She's a neoconservative. And so what happened was the U.S. foreign policy, starting in 1992, aimed for U.S. dominance, sometimes called full spectrum dominance, that in every region of the world, the U.S. should be able to blow away, figuratively, I hope, its opponents and antagonists, and to have geopolitical dominance through military, financial, economic, technological, and other means. And in 1992, that was the view. And it looked, who could rival us? Russia's down on its knees. China's a poor, rural country. Well, of course, it was never realistic. The world's never dominated by one country in all of history, though there have been empires, of course, that are powerful. But there's always going to be rivalry and always multipolarity in some sense, and that's especially true in the 21st century. Russia did not buckle under the U.S. View. China, even less so. I would say both of them say, no, we don't want a U.S.-led unipolar world. Now, the U.S. began to implement this in the 1990s with NATO enlargement. Anyone that knows the archival record knows that it wasn't just a loose verbiage, but it was a decided policy of Germany and the United States to promise to Gorbachev no NATO enlargement to the east, and not just to the east, to GDR, to the east. And so a lot of what's said right now is just typical U.S. government spin, but the archival record is actually very extensive. Then in the mid-1990s, Clinton started saying the same to Yeltsin, I know, that no, we're going to have a partnership system. We're not going to have NATO enlargement. But then Madeleine Albright pushed the neocon agenda. We're expanding NATO. And it created a big division inside the U.S. because there's some normal non-neocons inside the U.S., and I'm one of them, and said, no, NATO enlargement is a bad idea. And Bill Perry, who was the Secretary of Defense of Clinton, came close to resigning over this issue. George Kennan, who was our greatest statesman scholar of the 20th century vis-a-vis Russia, said this is the new Cold War. That was back in 1997 that he said that. Then many events followed. The U.S.-led alliance bombed Belgrade in 1999, broke Serbia apart deliberately as part of its geopolitics, and as per neocon ideas, went to war with all of Russia's allies in the Middle East, overthrowing Saddam Hussein, overthrowing Gaddafi, trying to overthrow Assad. So this was a very expansionist period of the U.S., trillions of dollars spent on expansionist wars. And in 2014, the U.S. was part of the successful effort to overthrow Yanukovych. This is absolutely clear. Although we don't know every bit, we know a lot. And I know a lot from my own knowledge about these events. The U.S. played a role in overthrowing a president of Ukraine who was basically pro-Russian, but basically trying to keep some kind of stable equilibrium between the two sides through neutrality of Ukraine. Yes, we want Western this. Yes, we want to keep relations with Russia. Very fragile because the U.S. is pushing NATO enlargement and Russia's saying, hell no. And this is what was happening. And Yanukovych was overthrown and a Western Ukraine, highly nationalist government was brought into power. And at that moment, Putin did what he warned George Bush Jr. he would do at the Bucharest summit in 2008. Putin said to George Bush, you expand NATO, we take Crimea back. Don't do it. But the U.S. doesn't listen. So we went to this direct clash, war in the Donbass. And then, sad to say, the Minsk agreements were reached. Germany and France were to be the guarantors. But I don't know if Mrs. Merkel, Chancellor Merkel, is speaking ex post as an excuse or telling what she thought at the time, but it's dreadful. What we do know is that the Ukrainians walked away from the Minsk agreements. After signing, my friends tell me, Jeff, how could you ever expect us to honor that? That's trash. I say, yeah, you have an agreement. An agreement. And we're supposed to take this with a straight face. And Germany was a solemn guarantor, uninterested. In the meantime, the U.S. poured in billions of dollars of armaments. By the end of 2021, Putin said to Biden, look, here are the red lines. And the number one red line is NATO enlargement, by far, by the way. And the U.S. said, we're not going to talk about that. Our door is open, which is a ridiculous idea. We're not talking about trade. We're talking about military alliances. What is this open door of military alliances in history that you don't care who your neighbors are aligned with, where the military bases are, what the weapons are? This is crazy rhetoric, I'm sorry to say, so provocative and dangerous. And the invasion started in February 2022, but the war, everyone should understand, started in February 2014. The war did not start in February 2022, and this is not the West reacting. The United States started in 1992 to break the agreements that it had given to Gorbachev. Why? Because they felt they could. That's it.
For me, it is quite clear that you're providing understanding in the role that the West played. But in German media and political discourse, this would be quickly labeled as justifying or the war or spreading Russian propaganda. Why do you think it is so difficult for Western media outlets and politicians to differentiate between understanding the role we played in this conflict that could perhaps help us learn from our mistakes and build a better foreign policy going forward versus justifying Russia's actions?
We need diplomats. Unfortunately, we don't have diplomats in Germany and in the United States right now because the foreign minister of Germany and the secretary of state of the United States are not engaging in diplomacy. They're engaging in war. This is different. Diplomacy is to sit down and talk to your counterpart to understand these issues. I was invited to give a talk to the G20 foreign ministers last year online when they were meeting in Bali. I said to them, you are the diplomats. Meet with each other. I don't think that Foreign Minister Baerbock met with Foreign Minister Lavrov, though they were in the same room. We need diplomacy. There is no way out of this mess without diplomacy. And if the diplomats want to be the ministers of war, then we should have those who want to be diplomats engaging in diplomacy. And we need that dialogue. I am in everyday dialogue with multiple sides. I hear from the Russian point of view. I hear from Turkey as mediator. I hear from Ukrainians. I hear from Western governments. I hear from the United States. I hear from Brazil, China, others. There are important views that need to be explained, and we're not getting that at all. And the media has forgotten its role. The media's role is not to quote unnamed senior officials. That is not the role of the media. The media's role is to scrutinize, to express doubt, to ask hard questions, to challenge authority, because it's not surprising that at war, our governments tell tales. They want to present narratives. They want to hide facts. They want to hide hard truths. But the media, what is the media for? Is it just for advertising revenues? Is it just for having the ability to have a cup of coffee with the senior government official? Or is it to scrutinize and express doubt? Where's the German media on Nord Stream, for example? Here, a major piece of infrastructure was blown up, I believe most likely by the United States or the UK, but on the Western side, quiet, silence. When I said this on American television, I was immediately cut off. But then, by the way, all of the circumstantial evidence points in that way. Sweden, incredibly, says, okay, we've investigated, but we're not going to share the results of our investigation with Germany. Members of the Bundestag ask, we want to know the facts. The German government says, no, you cannot know the facts. This is a security issue. We're supposed to take this? We call ourselves democracies? And this is the level of discourse? So the media really, I mean, look, there's a lot of media and you're part of it and it's great. We're having a wonderful open discussion and points of view that are very hard to express actually in the mainstream. But this mainstream media has lost its way. I can't tell you how disappointed I am every day in the New York Times, because I grew up with the New York Times and I used to read it for the Pentagon Papers, for telling the lies about Vietnam, exposing them, for telling the lies of the Nixon administration. Now all it is a mouthpiece for government. You don't get anything different. I can't even publish an op-ed on sites that I was probably the main contributor in many cases, because the mainstream media have lost their sense of their role completely. It is absolutely troubling and strange.
I want to go through some counter arguments with you that are usually made. For example, the first part, NATO was also stationed in Poland and Latvia that has borders with Russia, and they have coexisted somewhat peacefully. NATO was not planning an intervention. And the second counter argument that is made is Ukraine is an independent and sovereign state and has a right to make military deals with anyone it pleases, including NATO. How would you respond to these two arguments?
I would say that, first of all, NATO is often an aggressive force, almost an expeditionary force of U.S. foreign policy. Bombing Belgrade in 1999 was completely unjustified. The actions that NATO took in Libya, in my opinion, completely unjustified and far exceeded the UN mandate. And the United States foreign policy is based on regime change. So how much trust can there be, especially after events like the Maidan, the United States is not a peace-loving country. It is a power-seeking country. Not surprisingly, perhaps. I'm told by smart cynics, well, isn't that always the case? And maybe it is. But then let's not kid ourselves with the rhetoric that is used. The United States has overthrown dozens of governments. It definitely contributed to the overthrow of Yanukovych. It definitely tried to overthrow al-Assad in Syria and was a major provocation of the war there. And I know this from the inside, not just from the outside. So I just want to be clear that I know from top people involved in these issues what I'm discussing right now. So this is one thing, this idea of this peace-loving is not what a military alliance is. This is a military alliance that serves military and geopolitical purposes, and it should show restraint. In my opinion, by the way, just to put it clearly, when the Warsaw Pact was disbanded by Gorbachev, I think NATO should have ended. That's my own view. We should have gone to OSCE. We should have gone to a European security arrangement, but we didn't, because the neocons in the United States said, okay, now's really our chance. And I was at a conference recently in Eastern Europe where a NATO spokesman came in. It looked almost like a Star Wars event. He was full in uniform and there was a screen in back. And he talked about how NATO plays the vital role in the Black Sea region, and it will be crucial for Eurasia, or something like that. I said, oh my God, what is this? It's almost like a cartoon. I don't want to hear that. I was at an economics conference, by the way. I don't want to see NATO officials at an economics conference. So this is really, really an important point. And because this is a military alliance, it's not true that you just get to choose who you have your military alliances. There's a concept called externalities, which is that your choice may have adverse consequences for the one next door. Should the U.S. have a NATO base in the Sea of Azov? Well, Russia doesn't think so. By the way, I don't think so. I don't think it's prudent. And I don't think it's smart of Ukraine to not recognize that it's in a delicate balancing act and should be prudent and careful. And I'm living and experiencing, well, I'm seeing successive neutrality in many places. Let's just put it this way. And in my view, you be careful in this world. And you recognize that military alliances are dangerous because they lead to wars often. We should not have these military alliances. We should not be expanding military alliances in Asia to counter China. These are dangerous provocations. If you want really a historical analogy, it is maybe 1910. All these alliances being built. Well, and then a tripwire was crossed in 1914, and the world was never the same again. But let's avoid that.
In December last year, there was a lot of voicing for diplomacy stated by French President Macron, even President Biden. The German Chancellor, for example, even spoke to Putin for an hour on the phone, reportedly. However, the tone has completely shifted since the start of the new year. To begin the new year, NATO General Secretary Jens Stoltenberg said, and I'm quoting him here, "Weapons are in fact the way to peace." Now we're seeing all sorts of weapons, from armored vehicles, artillery, Patriot defense systems being committed to Ukraine. And the UK has now upped the ante by sending the Challenger 2 battle tanks. All eyes are on Berlin now. All the pressure is on Berlin. Tomorrow they're meeting, all the defense ministers are meeting at Ramstein Air Base. And it is expected that Germany will at some point capitulate to all this pressure and send also battle tanks known as the Leopard 2. What advice would you give to leaders of this conference if you were participating as well? And do you think advanced offensive weapons could change the tide of war?
The advice I would give to leaders, period, is sit down and start talking. Most importantly, President Biden and President Putin. And how can we have an approach that does not also include negotiations? This is mind-boggling. You see, it's quite interesting. Our top general in the United States, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Mark Milley, said, now is the time to negotiate. The next day, Victoria Nuland, who's our neocon in chief in the State Department, said, no negotiations. The whole idea is to bat down at all times any possibility of discussion. The only thing that's allowed in the narrative is war. Negotiations not even to be tried. So aside from all the weapon systems and whatever one thinks, open negotiations. And understand, by the way, and it's quite clear, Chancellor Scholz said to Putin at the beginning of all of this, NATO won't enlarge on my watch. He said, yes, you're Chancellor of Germany. What about NATO itself? How long are you going to be there? And the point is very simple. This is, first of all, a U.S.-led alliance. This is a 30-year U.S. project to expand NATO. President Biden's only words on this are, the door is open. The United States repeats at every occasion that